Welcome to Canada Files. I'm Valerie Pringle. My guest today is Cindy Blackstock, who is a member of the Gitxsan First Nation, an activist for child welfare, co-founder and executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, and a professor at the McGill University School of Social Work. She led a group that took the Canadian government to court over their discriminatory treatment of Indigenous children. It took 9 years, but they won. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You've described yourself as a single mom to 163,000 kids. Why did you decide that Indigenous kids needed your help, needed your protection?
That's how other people have described me. I kind of consider myself kind of an auntie. And the reason is that I've always been raptured by unfairness. Like, I grew up in the 1960s in northern British Columbia, and I didn't understand back then why everyone was so mad at us. And that's the only way I could pin it down, is that people thought Indians were bad people because we had done something wrong to them. That's how you think about it as a 5-year-old kid. And you also see that they're limiting what you could grow up to be, a drunk Indian, somebody on welfare, and none of that interested me. I always thought I can be more than this. I don't have to be this. But the fact that I was being fenced in, and I saw other children being fenced in by this systemic racism, by the government of Canada, and residential schools were then still operating, that struck me as so unfair.
But you had a remarkable insight from the point of view that your dad is First Nations and mom white.
Yeah.
So, you talk about you could go out with your mom and you were treated differently. And you could feel that completely differently than if you were holding your dad's hand.
Oh, absolutely. There is no question about it. That is the reality, is that I could go back and I could go forward. But this fence would automatically be put up around me when people would identify me as First Nations.
But you'd go like, I'm the same kid.
Exactly. And I couldn't understand this. And I would also think about what is it about these people that make them think this? And I remember getting CBC in black and white back then. That's all we had. And we would see the civil rights movement. And we'd see these KKK members then burning crosses. And I talked to the townspeople about that, and they agreed that that was a terrible thing to do. But these were the same people who would say that you're going to grow up to be a drunk Indian.
You say living the difference between the white world and First Nation world set you on the course of a lifetime. Yeah. And that was the question of why. Why? Why are we treated different? What is the difference?
Yeah, what is the difference?
What do you find? What is it? It's racism.
It's racism, and it was baked right into the DNA of the country. The Indian Act is the oldest piece of legislation we have in the country, and it applies to First Nations. And if you take a close read, most Canadians haven't even Googled it, but if you get onto Google and you see that this thing regulates your wills and estates, it determines who is and who is not a First Nations person from the accordance of the government, and they give you a card for this. I mean, this is stuff we hear about in South Africa, but we so normalized it here in Canada. And that racism modeled by the federal government was seeded into society too, because non-Indigenous Canadians, particularly back then, learned nothing about First Nations other than stereotypes.
They keep saying, oh, well, we're going to get rid of the Indian Act. I mean, they've been talking about that for decades.
4 decades. And I think that this is part of the thing, is when we see these things, we assume that there's no solution. But my experience is there is a solution. The government is choosing not to do it, and they choose not to do it because they think that Canadians are asleep and they don't care.
Well, back to your growing up and you're looking at America and the civil rights movement, and you were, reading and really moved by, not only Martin Luther King, but reading about Gandhi and, and others, about civil rights. In your bones, something spoke to you.
Oh, yeah. It was like I would see these people with such dignity. That's what struck me about the Black people and their allies in the United States, is that the dignity of it and the indignity of those who were claiming that they were more civilized. But I thought, why don't we have something like that here? We have the same seeds of this type of discrimination happening in Canada. And in fact, residential schools were an export of the treatment of the US government towards Native Americans. And so why is it that this isn't addressed?
Well, there have been some issues, in the last couple of years. People would say there's been a change in the conversation. The report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with 94 calls to action, what Canadians can do. It got a huge amount of attention. And then unmarked graves were found by a residential school. Not a surprise to people who know that story, but to a lot of Canadians, and subsequently more graves found. Do you think it has caused the people of Canada to feel differently?
Oh yeah, and it also has resulted in the government of Canada reacting differently. So you'll remember when the 215 unmarked graves were found in Kamloops in the residential schools there. Thousands of Canadians were out with orange shirts. In fact, Canada Day fell shortly after that, and instead of wearing red and white, people were wearing orange.
Which was the color to wear in remembrance of the kids.
Exactly. And so in the 6 weeks following the discovery of those unmarked graves, the Government of Canada implemented more of the TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calls to action than it did in the previous 6 years. So when Canadians are paying attention and demanding action, the government will make a choice to act.
Now, I had talked in the introduction, that you took the government to court.
Yeah.
So 9 years of being fought and obfuscated. The government's fighting you for saying you discriminate against Indigenous kids. This is an issue before the Human Rights Commission. And I say, after 9 years you won, but what did winning look like?
Well, winning meant that we got a decision that said that yes, Canada was making a choice to racially discriminate against First Nations children in ways that separated them from their families unnecessarily, created harms, and contributed to their deaths. And it ordered the Government of Canada to stop. But they did what they always do. They paraded out a bunch of ministers. Oh, this is good, we love First Nations kids, and then they did nothing. And so we've had now 24 procedural non-compliance orders against the Canadian government in the wake of the TRC. This is going back like
almost 8 years, though.
Oh,
Still
yeah.
non-compliance. So when I say you won, you haven't won yet.
No, and I think this is a mistake a lot of people make, is that they actually call for procedural mechanisms like an inquiry or a ruling from a court and think that that's the win. The win is when people's lives change for the better. And that's where I've always had my eye, is that child in that First Nations community able to access the health and social services and the supports to keep them growing up safely at home that they deserve? If not, then we need to push forward, and that's what we've done.
Your awareness of this began in your first job, really, as a child protection officer in British Columbia. And you were among those people who had to go into homes and see parents who were fit or unfit and make a decision, do these children stay here or not? And now you decided in one case, I think your first, that the children had to leave, and it kind of haunted you.
Yeah, it did haunt me. It haunted me because I don't think I had a full sense of that we really had apartheid public services in Canada, and that apartheid public services, coupled with the post-traumatic stress of the residential schools, which only closed in Canada in 1996, that was creating situations where almost nobody would succeed. It was a recipe for failure. It was a recipe for trauma. And what was happening in child welfare is we were judging that it was the parent that wasn't able. But it really wasn't about the parent at all. It was about the system.
Tell me about Jordan's principle. Tell me about Jordan and what's come of, what he was able to accomplish.
This is the thing, is the human consequences of this stuff, right? So this is a little boy. He's born from Norway House Cree Nation, and there was a high-risk pregnancy, so his mom, Virginia, gave birth to him in Winnipeg. He had to stay in a hospital for 2 years, right? This is something far too many parents are familiar with. But finally, the day comes when he could go home. Like, I mean, bringing home the baby is a big day, right? And if he was non-Indigenous, he would have gone home. They would have had the in-home supports that he needed to be able to stay in his family home and get the medical care. But because he was First Nations, the government of Canada was supposed to be funding his services. And the government of Manitoba, the province where he lived, said, oh, well, that's a federal government responsibility. So what they did is they argued for over 2.5 years about each individual item, like shower heads that he would need, that kind of nonsense. And while this child stayed in a hospital, his pediatrician sent a letter saying a hospital is not a place for a child to grow up in. This child should get at-home care. His sister said, Gerlene Sullivan said, eventually Jordan died of a broken heart. He saw other little children coming in not well and then leaving when they were better. He was better, but he was trapped in his hospital because of who he was. And he dies at the age of 5, never having been outside of the hospital walls, just because of who he was. And we found 393 kids in that same situation, and we're just doing a very small study of 12 of the 105 First Nations agencies. So this was happening to kids all over the country. The family asked us to do something about it. So Jordan's principle, which is about ensuring First Nations kids can get the help they need when they need it, that's the answer. And so it was part of the litigation in that human rights case we talked about.
But it's having an impact. I mean,
oh yeah. So now, thanks to Jordan's principle, we've had about over 2 million services provided to First Nations kids that they otherwise would have been denied. And to give you a sense, it's things like Canada was capping the number of feeding tubes you could have for your child. So parents were having to think, well, do I rewash this thing and risk infection for my child, or do I not feed them? We had children in palliative care denied basic things for respiration. We had kids who had learning disabilities who never ever got the help that they needed and grew up feeling that they were dumb and that they were a failure. Like, it was the denial of basic things that every child deserves in a rich country like this.
And the number of kids in foster care, I mean, this is, I think people have awakened to the shame and horror of residential schools. And you say, we're creating another generation, who are, being removed from homes and put into foster care or cared for by the state. It's another making the same mistake twice.
Oh yeah, at a bigger scale. There are 3 times the number of First Nations children in care today than there was at the height of residential schools in the 1940s and 50s. And when we think about child welfare, often amongst the public, you think these are parents who are just, choosing not to look after their kids. But imagine yourself, if I was in downtown Toronto or whatever, and I cut your water. 1 in 6 First Nations folks don't have water. 35% of you will have broadband access, the rest of you won't. We're going to cut every public service, from education to your hydroelectric access, everything, down by about 30%. And then I'm going to foist the trauma of residential schools on you and your family. And then I'm going to come and check you and see how well you're parenting your kids. And I'm going to use the same standard as everyone else who's not affected by any of that. That's why we have so many kids in child welfare care. We need to get at the roots of the problem, which are poverty, it's poor housing, both things related to the inequalities in funding, and then we have things like addictions and mental health that are owing to residential schools. Those are things that we need to get at. And we can with equitable services that are culturally based.
So can money solve this problem?
It is a big part of solving the problem. Like, people say, well, you can't throw money at it. I said, well, actually, when you're giving people far less than everybody else, throwing money at the problem to bring them up to the same level of opportunity, that is part of the solution, but it's not the full solution. The full solution is that we need to make sure that things are culturally based and available to people to address these very serious traumas that have been going on for over 100 years.
Does anybody get this right in the Americas, post-colonialism, in New Zealand, in Australia, in America?
Well, I think that there's nuggets of possibility happening in all these different places, but the same kind of systemic failures on behalf of the governments are there. So, for example, in the United States, there was a study in 2016 that showed the various rates of health care that populations who receive federal funding for health care receive. So things like veterans and federally incarcerated prisoners and Native Americans. Well, what that study found is that a federally incarcerated prisoner received health care at about the rate of $6,500 per capita from the federal government in the U.S., whereas a Native American got about $1,200 per capita. And I'm not suggesting the prisoner doesn't deserve that $6,500, but it makes you wonder why they think Native Americans can get by with $1,200. And we saw that during COVID-19 with the Navajo reservation, where you have very few homes with water, and then you had those unbelievable rates of COVID. It's no surprise.
Do you find it's the same with anti-Black racism, or do you differentiate?
I think that there are some similarities, but the difference is it's the Indian Act. So there's actually a piece of legislation that affects First Nations in Canada, whereas there isn't a national piece of legislation that would somehow systemically discriminate in a very, very focused way on Black people in Canada. There's also the issue of the land. Like, we've been here for thousands of years. And so, that kind of dispossession of the land story is very, very important. And that's not to at all diminish the experience of racism against Black Canadians, but it is to say that it's different.
But it's interesting because you said or wrote that, as a little kid, you kind of felt you ingested some racism as well.
Oh yeah, you do. Like, my first job was, I was 4 years old, I was pine cone picking. Right? We go out and get gunny sacks, and you put your pine cones in there and they'd be used to reforest things. I had no idea that at that same time there were people out there hunting for kids like me to put into residential schools. And you get the sense that who you are is not going to be okay. I didn't want to grow up to be on welfare or a drunk Indian. And I knew that if I was something else, then I had more possibilities. I could do other stuff. Look at Mary Tyler Moore on TV. She had a job. She was a journalist. There was stuff you could do. That looked a lot better to me. And so you do take on board that systemic racism. It's like a denial of who you are, because if you are who society says you are, and then you absorb those fences
and those stereotypes,
then your future isn't that great.
And tell me about your courage. I mean, you've talked even about not being comfortable public speaking.
Oh,
now
yeah,
you speak all the time.
Oh, I was scared stiff. I would transfer. That's how I ended up in these obscure courses like 17th century literature and all this other stuff, right? I was petrified. I'd look at the syllabus. If it said presentation, I was out of there. I think that, often we are most afraid of the thing that we have to give the most generously to society. And for me, when I was doing social work at the frontline level, I saw this discrimination. It became very, very crystal clear to me. And what was also evident is that I was not the person to do it. That's what I thought. So I thought, for sure, there's somebody else out there who's smarter than I am, who knows more than I am. And my job, my contribution is I'm going to put the hole in the dike with the families I'm working with, and I'm going to wait around for this person to appear. And then after a year or so, I looked around, and there's lots of people doing exactly what I did. And it came to me, there's a poem in a book of poetry that my aunt gave me by Patrick Overton. And it says, when you step across that place where light leads into darkness, there'll be something solid to stand on, or you'll be taught to fly. And I've been taught to fly by a lot of different people. And, I just decided, I thought, I got to love these kids enough to show them that I love them enough to try, to get over my own fears and to try and do something. And even if I fail, then they will have seen me trying instead of just standing there and doing nothing while they were being hurt.
And know that they were worth it.
And know that they were worth it.
I also think of the courage it took to take the government to court and fight for 9 years.
Yeah, it's been 16 years now, where the case is still going on.
Yeah.
We had a wonderful teaching by an elder when we created the Caring Society, which is the organization I'm honored to work with. And he said, never fall in love with your organization, the Caring Society, because we were so excited. We actually finally got some funding to get like an office. He said, never fall in love with that. He said, never fall in love with your business card. Only fall in love with the kids, because there will come a day when you have to sacrifice both those things for them. And he actually said to us when we were starting our little organization, he said, I want you to figure out what you're prepared to die for as an organization. And that was, if the government didn't implement these reports and treat these kids fairly, then we were prepared to go all in. For that same reason, when I stepped across the place where light leads into darkness, that we wanted to show these kids that we loved them enough to stand with them, to stand in the winds of that discrimination so that they didn't have to do it alone. So when we filed the complaint, within 30 days, the federal government of Canada cut all of our core funding. And up until today, we're the only Indigenous organization nationally that doesn't have government money.
And they put you under surveillance for a while.
Oh yeah, they put me under surveillance.
I mean, it's sort of like Martin Luther King and, in fact, you've been described by a member of Parliament as Canada's Martin Luther King at this moment for First Nations.
Well, I'm not sure I'm at that level, but yeah, this whole surveillance thing. I was, like, I'm a social worker. I don't even have a parking ticket. And, like, you think of surveillance, you think about people like, looking at criminal activity, that kind of stuff. But they were, for over 4 years, and we know this from the government's documents, they wanted to get this case dismissed. And they knew the facts were against them. So the way that they would get it dismissed is either discrediting me or trying on a procedural item. And that's why they put me under surveillance. And it was found to be unlawful. And I was given $20,000, which I donated to all children's organizations. And we actually used some of that money to have a party to celebrate the court case when the kids won.
What do you see with the next generation?
It depends on whether we trust them with the truth. When we trust children with the truth and we tell them about residential schools and we teach them how to make a difference in society in peaceful and respectful ways, kids step up to the plate. In fact, in our case, the hearing room was populated by non-Indigenous and First Nations kids of all diversities. And they could see very clearly what the rest of society couldn't, because they hadn't been bathed in all this normalization of the discrimination. They said, what do you mean? This child doesn't get this, or they get less because they're First Nations? Well, that's wrong. It needs to be fixed. There was no excuses about it. So they were active in the case. But I also see a lot of adults freaked out about telling children the truth. Oh, well, we can't tell them about residential schools, it'll make them uncomfortable. It's actually not true at all. When you can tell children difficult things about the world, as long as you give them the possibility of being co-creators in a different type of society that would make them proud and really realizes the human rights of other people. So it's the adults who are standing in the way of that future.
Well, all of us have to have difficult conversations.
Oh yeah, and that's part of life and part of growing up. And you know what? When I look back at my life and I think, yeah, figuring out this racism is happening to First Nations kids, that wasn't a very pleasant thing. But what a blessing I've had to be a part of maybe turning the boat on that a bit.
Well, you and Spirit Bear are on the right side of history.
I think so, because the kids are on the right side of history. We're taught that children are the most sacred. And some people think it's the elders in our community, and elders are important, but they're only important because they teach the children. And when you have children of all diversities who can see the possibility of a different world where every child does count, where every child does matter, as we say on Orange Shirt Day, and they're working towards it, then you're in the right boat.
So the final question, what does being a First Nation person in Canada mean to you?
It's about seeing I'm not blind to the wonderful things about living in a society like this, and especially for people who live in very toxic situations around the world. The women in Afghanistan and can't go to school. the people in the Ukraine who are fighting against the wars. Those are all things I'm aware of that we don't have here. But what I do see myself is having to resolve the contradiction between what Canada says it is and the way that it treats First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And some people think that it's not patriotic when you're taking the government of Canada to court and et cetera. But I actually look at it very differently. I actually am not allied to a country per se. I'm allied to values of a people that get embodied within a community that we call Canada. And my work is as much about bringing Canada into alignment with those values of justice, of truth, of compassion. And that to me is probably the best I'm going to be able to do on the patriotic front, while still recognizing that we have fabulous and rightful rights as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples.
Thank you, Cindy.
Thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of Canada Files.
The preceding program was made possible through the generous support of Jim and Sandra Piplado, as well as the following donors: Ted and Alice Kernahan, the Browning Watt Foundation, Mary Davey, Michael McCain and family, Tony and Sherry Fell, David and Cheryl Carr, Bryce and Nikki Douglas, Richard Wernham and Julia West, Charles and Marilyn Bailey, Richard Pilasoff, Clench House Foundation, Kathy and George Dombrowski, the 63 Foundation, and by the Central Canadian Public Television Association.